Okay, so now that we selected our outgroup and we know the traits that we're going to use to try to identify the different clades for these organisms, we're going to fill out a character matrix. And with the character matrix, what you're really doing is saying if the trait is derived or ancestral in the organisms in question. So you can see here on this matrix that we have our lamprey, which is our outgroup, and then all the other organisms that are in question below that. So since lampreys are the outgroup, they're going to indicate the ancestral traits. So we could put ancestral for each one of these characters for the lamprey. All right, and now we're going to compare the other organisms to the character of the lamprey, which is the ancestral trait. So to determine if the other organisms have an ancestral characteristic or a derived characteristic. Now, lampreys do not have jaws. They're jawless fish. So not having a jaw is the ancestral trait. So we're going through the frog here. Frogs do have jaws. So we're going to say they derived jaws at some point. So the ancestral trait is no jaws, while the derived characteristic is having a jaw. Same thing with lungs. Frogs have lungs, while lampreys do not, since they are fish. So the next characteristic is an amniotic membrane. And amniotic membranes evolved in reptiles. So reptiles and mammals contain amniotic membranes, while amphibians and fish will not. So since frogs are amphibians, they do not have an amniotic membrane. So they would have an ancestral trait, just like the lamprey does not have an amniotic membrane. The next trait, hair. Frogs do not have hair, and so the ancestral trait is not having a hair, just like the lamprey. The next characteristic of tail, frogs do not have a tail. Adult frogs do not have tails, but lampreys do. So since lampreys have a tail and frogs do not, this is a derived characteristic. And then finally, being bipedal is another ancestral trait. Lampreys are not bipedal, and neither are frogs. Okay, going through the salamander. Salamanders have jaws. They have lungs. They do not have amniotic eggs. They do not have hair. They do have a tail, just like a lamprey would, so that'd be ancestral. And they are not bipedal, just like the lamprey. So again, ancestral. Moving on to lizards. Lizards do have a jaw. All right, so that's a derived characteristic. Lizards do have lungs, unlike the lamprey. Lizards are reptiles, so they do have an amniotic membrane. So that is a derived characteristic, since the lamprey does not have that. Lizards do not have hair, just like a lamprey, so that's ancestral. Lizards do have tails, just like a lamprey does, so that is ancestral. And again, lizards are not bipedal, just like the lamprey, so that is ancestral. Moving on to tigers. Tigers have jaws, unlike the lamprey, so that's derived. Tigers do have lungs, unlike a lamprey, so that is derived. Tigers are mammals, so they do have amniotic membranes. Tigers have hair, since they're mammals. Tigers do have tails, so that's an ancestral trait. And again, tigers are not bipedal. So again, ancestral. Moving on to gorillas. Gorillas have jaws, so that's a derived characteristic. Gorillas have lungs, which is also derived. Gorillas are mammals, so they have amniotic membranes, so that's derived. Gorillas have hair, so that's another derived trait. Gorillas do not have a tail, so lampreys have tails, gorillas don't, so that's a derived characteristic. But gorillas are not bipedal, so that's, again, ancestral. Moving on to sharks. Sharks do have jaws. Sharks do not have lungs, just like the lamprey, so that is an ancestral characteristic. Sharks do not have an amniotic membrane, just like lampreys, so that is another ancestral characteristic. Sharks do not have hair, so that's another ancestral characteristic. Sharks do have tails, so that is again ancestral, since lampreys have tails. And sharks are again not bipedal, just like the lamprey. Then we get to humans. Humans have jaws, so that's derived, because it's unlike the lamprey. Humans have lungs, unlike a lamprey, so that's derived. Humans are mammals, so they have amniotic membranes. Humans have hair. Humans do not have a tail, unlike a lamprey, which does have a tail, so that's another derived characteristic. And humans are bipedal. We walk on two legs. So that is another derived characteristic. All right, so now that we have our characteristic matrix, we can move on to the next step.